The screen door slammed for the last time as 12-year-old Emma watched her mother's taillights disappear into the dust cloud, leaving nothing but withered corn stalks and a silence so thick it pressed against her chest like the August heat that had stolen everything green from their Iowa farm. Emma's bare feet found the familiar grooves in the wooden porch as she sat motionless, her father's heavy breathing the only sound cutting through the morning stillness. The drought had been merciless, 3 months without a drop of rain, and now their corn stood like brittle soldiers in formation, brown and defeated. But it wasn't the failed crop that made her stomach twist into knots. It was the note her mother had left on the kitchen table, weighted down by a coffee mug that still held yesterday's cold dregs. I can't watch everything die anymore. Take care of your father. I'm sorry. The words had been burned into Emma's mind since dawn, when she'd found her father standing in the kitchen, holding the paper like it might crumble to dust in his hands. His shoulders had shaken once, just once, before he'd folded the note carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "She'll be back," he'd whispered, more to himself than to Emma. "She just needs some time." But Emma had seen the way her mother's eyes had grown distant over the past weeks, staring out at the failing fields with the same hollow expression she'd worn after losing the baby 2 years ago. There had been no tears this time, no screaming matches with Dad about money or the bank's threatening letters. Just a quiet emptying, like water slowly draining from a cracked basin. The sun climbed higher, and Emma could feel sweat beading on her forehead. Inside, her father moved around the kitchen with mechanical precision, washing the same plate 3 times, opening and closing cabinet doors, the coffee pot gurgling as he made his 4th cup since sunrise. She knew he was avoiding the fields, avoiding the reality that stretched in all directions around their small farmhouse. A meadowlark called from somewhere beyond the fence line, its song bright and defiant against the morning heat. Emma closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of rain on the metal roof, the way the corn used to whisper in the evening breeze when it was tall and green and full of promise. But those memories felt like someone else's life now. "Emma." Her father's voice drifted through the screen door, rough and uncertain. "You want some breakfast, honey?" She turned to look at him through the mesh. Robert Mitchell, who'd worked this land since he was younger than she was now, whose hands could coax life from the most stubborn soil. His face was drawn tight with exhaustion, gray stubble covering cheeks that had grown gaunt over the summer. The note was still tucked in his pocket, creating a small square outline against the faded flannel. "I'm not hungry, Dad." He nodded, understanding flooding his weathered features. "Me neither." They sat in companionable silence, father and daughter separated by a thin screen but united in their disbelief. Around them, the farm held its breath. The chickens huddled in whatever shade they could find, their usual chatter reduced to occasional, listless clucks. Even Old Blue, their border collie, had given up his morning patrol and lay panting in the dirt beside the water pump. Emma's gaze wandered to the garden her mother had tended with such fierce devotion. The tomato plants hung limp on their stakes, the leaves curled and brown despite the daily rations of precious well water. Her mother had stood there just yesterday morning, hosing down the wilted vegetables with a desperation that seemed to drain something vital from her with each passing minute. "The bank called again," her father said quietly, breaking the spell. "We got maybe 3 weeks before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Emma understood. The farm, their home, their history, their everything, would be gone. Another casualty of the drought that had claimed half the county. Emma pressed her palms against the warm wood of the porch, feeling the familiar splinters and worn smooth spots where generations of Mitchell feet had worn away the grain. Her great-grandfather had built this house in 1892, had weathered droughts and storms and the Great Depression. But he'd had his family beside him. He hadn't faced it alone with a 12-year-old daughter who was trying so hard to be strong that her chest ached with the effort. "She left because of me, didn't she?" The words escaped before Emma could stop them, carried on a whisper that barely disturbed the heavy air. Her father was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "No, Sweetheart. She left because she's hurting in a way that makes it hard to see past the hurt. Sometimes grown-ups, sometimes we don't make the right choices when we're scared. Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. She'd heard the hushed conversations late at night, the way her parents' voices had grown sharp when they talked about money, about the future, about what would happen if the rains didn't come. She'd felt the weight of their worries settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. A red-winged blackbird landed on the fence post nearest the porch, its bright shoulder patches like tiny flames against the gray morning. It tilted its head, studying Emma with one bright eye before launching itself into flight, disappearing into the brown expanse of what had once been their cornfield. Emma watched until it was just a speck against the pale sky, and found herself making a silent promise to that bird, to the farm, to her father sitting so still behind the screen door. She wouldn't leave. Whatever came next, the bank, the auction, the inevitable goodbye to the only home she'd ever known, she would face it here, with her feet planted firmly on Mitchell land. As if sensing her resolution, a gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faint scent of something Emma couldn't quite identify. Something green and alive, impossibly hopeful in the midst of so much death. She breathed it in deeply, holding it in her lungs like a prayer, and for the first time since finding her mother's note, she felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen just a little. The drought had taken so much from them. But it hadn't taken everything. Not yet. The knock came at sunset, soft and hesitant against their front door. Emma looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read, the same page she'd stared at for the past hour while her father dozed fitfully in his recliner. They rarely had visitors anymore. Most of their neighbors were fighting their own battles with the drought, and the few who'd managed to hold on were too busy trying to save what they could to spare time for social calls. Emma padded to the door in her bare feet, peering through the peephole to see a slight figure standing on their porch. Mrs. Chen from the neighboring property held a covered dish in her weathered hands, her silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for as long as Emma could remember. The Chen farm had been struggling too, though their vegetable operation seemed to be faring slightly better than the Mitchells' corn. "Mrs. Chen?" Emma opened the door, surprised to see their usually reserved neighbor standing there as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Hello, Emma." Mrs. Chen's voice was soft, accented with the careful precision of someone who'd learned English as a second language. "I brought some soup. For you and your father." She extended the dish, steam rising from beneath the lid despite the evening heat. Emma's stomach growled, reminding her that neither she nor her father had managed more than a few bites of toast since morning. "That's very kind, but we couldn't." "My vegetables are not completely dead yet," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. "And soup is better when shared. This I know." Behind Emma, she heard her father stirring in his chair, the creak of old springs announcing his awakening. Mrs. Chen's timing was perfect. He'd been dozing through dinner again, the weight of the day's revelations pressing him into an exhausted sleep that brought no real rest. "Is that Helen Chen?" Robert's voice carried through the house, hope threading through the fatigue. "Ask her to come in, Em. It's too hot to stand out there." Mrs. Chen stepped across the threshold, and Emma noticed how her neighbor's eyes took in everything. The stack of unpaid bills on the hall table, the family photos gathering dust, the general air of defeat that had settled over their home like a fine layer of drought dust. But there was no judgment in her expression, only a quiet understanding that made Emma's throat tighten unexpectedly. "I heard about Sarah," Mrs. Chen said to Robert as he appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up at odd angles from his restless nap. "I am sorry." Robert nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The simple acknowledgment of his pain seemed to hit him harder than all the well-meaning platitudes their other neighbors had offered. Mrs. Chen didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances or speculation about when Sarah might return. She simply stood there, holding her gift of soup and radiating a calm presence that somehow made the house feel less empty. "You don't need to," Robert began, but Mrs. Chen held up one small, work-calloused hand. "My husband used to say that accepting help is also a gift," she said. "You give me the chance to be useful. This is not nothing." Emma watched the exchange, struck by the way Mrs. Chen's words seemed to lift something from her father's shoulders. For the first time all day, he stood a little straighter, his eyes focusing on something other than the middle distance where his worries lived. They moved to the kitchen, and Mrs. Chen ladled the soup into 3 bowls with the efficiency of someone accustomed to feeding people. The broth was clear and fragrant, filled with vegetables Emma recognized from the Chen's garden: bok choy and carrots, onions and what looked like snap peas. Simple ingredients transformed into something that smelled like comfort itself. "This is wonderful," Emma said after her first spoonful, and meant it. The warmth spread through her chest, easing an ache she hadn't realized was there. Beside her, her father ate with more appetite than she'd seen from him in weeks. "My grandmother's recipe," Mrs. Chen explained. "She used to make it during the war, when food was difficult to find. She said it could make a feast from scraps, hope from very little." As they ate, Mrs. Chen spoke in quiet tones about her own struggles: the irrigation system that was failing, the customers who could no longer afford to buy produce, the letters from her grown children suggesting she sell the farm and move to the city to live with them. Emma realized that their neighbor was carrying her own version of their burden, facing her own impossible choices with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. "But my vegetables still grow," Mrs. Chen continued. "Not as many, not as strong, but they grow. And growing things, they teach us about patience, about hope when we cannot see the reason for it." After dinner, Mrs. Chen insisted on washing the bowls, her small hands moving efficiently in the soapy water while Emma dried and Robert stood awkwardly by, clearly struggling with the unfamiliar role of being cared for. When the last dish was put away, their neighbor gathered her empty pot and moved toward the door. "Mrs. Chen," Emma called out, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to get them out. Would you like to sit on the porch for a while? It's cooler now." The older woman paused, considering, then nodded. "Yes, I would like that." They settled onto the porch as full darkness claimed the sky, the 3 of them arranged in comfortable silence on the old wooden chairs that had hosted countless evening conversations in better times. Mrs. Chen produced a thermos of jasmine tea from her bag, pouring it into small cups that she'd brought with her, as if she'd planned this moment of shared quiet all along. The tea was fragrant and soothing, and Emma found herself relaxing for the first time since morning. Above them, stars began to appear in the clear sky, bright pinpricks of light unmarred by the humidity that usually shrouded summer evenings. The drought had stolen their rain, but it had given them this, a sky so clear and vast it seemed to hold infinite possibilities. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Chen said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I will show you something. About hope. About what grows when we think nothing can." Emma looked at her neighbor's profile in the starlight, seeing something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of secrets, of knowledge earned through years of coaxing life from reluctant earth. For the first time since her mother had left, Emma felt a flutter of genuine curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. The night air stirred around them, carrying the same mysterious scent Emma had noticed earlier, green and alive, impossible but undeniable. Mrs. Chen smiled into her teacup, as if she knew exactly what that fragrance meant. Emma woke before dawn, pulled from restless sleep by the sound of her father moving quietly through the house. She lay in bed listening to the familiar morning ritual, coffee brewing, the back door creaking open, his boots on the porch steps as he went to check on their few remaining animals. But today, something was different. Instead of the heavy, defeated footsteps she'd grown accustomed to, there was purpose in his movement, a hint of the man he'd been before the drought had worn him down to the bone. She dressed quickly and found him standing in the kitchen, staring out the window toward the Chen property. His coffee mug sat untouched on the counter, steam rising like morning mist in the yellow light of their old lamp. "Dad." Emma's voice was still thick with sleep. "Everything okay?" He turned to her, and she was startled to see something like wonder in his weathered features. Come look at this." She joined him at the window, following his gaze toward their cornfield. At first she saw only what she'd expected, row upon row of brown, brittle stalks standing like tombstones in the pale light. But then her eyes adjusted, and she gasped. Scattered throughout the dead corn, impossible spots of green caught the early morning light. Not the corn itself, that was beyond saving, but something else. Something that hadn't been there yesterday. "What is that?" Emma breathed, pressing her face to the glass. "I don't know," Robert admitted. "But Mrs. Chen is out there looking at it too." Sure enough, their neighbor stood at the fence line between their properties, her small figure almost lost in the vastness of the field. She held something in her hands, a basket, Emma realized, and was moving slowly along the border, bending occasionally to examine the mysterious green growth. Emma pulled on her boots and followed her father outside, the morning air cool against her skin despite the promise of another scorching day. As they approached Mrs. Chen, the older woman turned to greet them with a smile that seemed to hold secrets. "Good morning," she said simply. "I brought breakfast." She held up the basket, which Emma could now see contained fresh biscuits and what looked like preserves. "And I wanted to show you something." Mrs. Chen led them into the field, picking her way carefully between the rows of failed corn. Up close, the green growth was even more remarkable, tender shoots of what looked like beans and squash, climbing up the dead corn stalks as if they were trellises put there for exactly that purpose. "How is this possible?" Robert's voice was hushed, reverent. "Nothing should grow in this soil, in this heat, without water." Mrs. Chen knelt beside one of the thriving plants, her fingers gentle as she examined a perfect young bean pod. "My grandmother taught me about companion planting," she said. "How some plants help others, even in the hardest conditions. The corn roots, even dead, they still hold the soil together. They make channels for what little moisture there is. And these seeds—" She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag. "They are special. Old varieties. Strong." Emma stared at their neighbor, understanding dawning like sunrise. "You planted these." "Last night, after we had dinner." Mrs. Chen nodded, no shame in her admission. "While you slept. I have been saving these seeds for 20 years, waiting for the right time to use them. They came from my grandmother's garden in China, from plants that survived worse droughts than this one. But seeds are meant to be shared, not hoarded." Robert sank to his knees beside one of the plants, his hands trembling as he touched the green leaves. "Helen, this is— I can't accept this. We can't pay you back, can't even afford to keep the land much longer." "You think I want payment?" Mrs. Chen's voice carried a gentle scolding. "You think I planted these for money?" She settled onto the ground beside him, her movements careful but determined. "My husband died in this field, you know. 5 years ago, heart attack during harvest. I found him right there, between those 2 rows. Emma felt her breath catch. She'd never known the details of Mr. Chen's death, only that he'd passed suddenly one autumn morning. "For 2 years after, I could not plant anything," Mrs. Chen continued, her eyes focused on the middle distance. "The land, it felt cursed to me. Empty. I wanted to sell, to leave, to forget this place that had taken the man I loved. My children, they begged me to come to the city, to live with them in their small apartments where I could watch their children grow up safe from heartbreak." She paused, pulling a faded photograph from her shirt pocket. Emma could see the edges were worn soft from handling, the image of a stocky man with kind eyes standing beside a much younger Mrs. Chen in front of a thriving garden. "But Thomas, he used to say that the land remembers everything, every seed planted, every harvest gathered, every tear that waters the soil. He said that leaving would be like throwing away all those memories, all that love we had poured into this place." Her voice grew soft, almost whispered. So I stayed. And slowly, I learned that growing things again was not betraying his memory, but honoring it. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. Sarah couldn't see past the dying, he said finally. She looked at these fields and saw only what we'd lost, never what might still be possible. Grief makes us blind sometimes, Mrs. Chen acknowledged. But it also makes us hungry for hope, even when we don't know we're hungry. These plants, they grow not because the conditions are perfect, but because they remember how to be strong. Just like you will remember, in time. Emma watched the two adults sitting in the dirt among the impossible green growth, sharing their wounds like old friends. Around them, the morning light grew stronger, illuminating the tiny miracles that had sprouted overnight in their dead field. She thought about her mother's note, about the hollow look in her eyes as she'd stared out at the failing crops. "Will they spread?" Emma asked, surprising herself with the question. "The plants, I mean. Will more grow?" Mrs. Chen smiled, the first truly joyful expression Emma had seen on her neighbor's face. "Seeds find their way, Emma. They always do. Some will scatter in the wind, some will be carried by birds, some will fall where they land and wait for the right moment to begin again. That is what seeds do. They survive, they persist, they hope." As if summoned by her words, a meadowlark called from somewhere in the field, its song bright and defiant against the morning sky. Emma closed her eyes and breathed in the green scent she'd noticed the night before, stronger now, more real. It was the smell of possibility, of life insisting on itself against all odds. When she opened her eyes, both adults were looking at her with expressions of quiet pride, as if they saw something in her face that she was only just beginning to understand herself. 3 weeks later, Emma stood in the same spot where she'd first discovered the miracle beans, but the field had transformed beyond recognition. What had started as scattered green shoots among the dead corn had become a sprawling garden of interconnected growth. Bean vines heavy with pods wrapped around corn stalks, squash plants spread their broad leaves across the ground between rows, and small tomato plants had somehow taken root in the spaces where Mrs. Chen's careful tending had created pockets of richer soil. The bank notice was still tucked behind the sugar bowl on their kitchen table, but it no longer felt like a death sentence. Something had shifted in the 3 weeks since Mrs. Chen had shared her seeds and her story, not just in the field, but in the house, in her father, in Emma herself. "The agricultural extension agent is coming today," Robert called from the porch, his voice carrying a note of excitement that had been absent for months. "Mrs. Chen thinks what we've got here might be worth documenting." Emma nodded, her hands busy harvesting beans into the basket she'd inherited from her mother's abandoned garden supplies. The irony wasn't lost on her, using her mother's tools to gather hope from soil that had seemed dead when Sarah had given up on it. But the bitterness that might have accompanied such thoughts had softened into something more complex, more forgiving. "Dad," Emma said, straightening up with her basket full of the morning's harvest. "I've been thinking about something." Robert joined her in the field, moving more easily than he had in months. The mysterious plants had given him more than food, they'd given him purpose, a reason to get up each morning and tend to something living. His face had filled out slightly, and the constant worry lines around his eyes had relaxed into something approaching peace. "What's that, sweetheart?" Emma gestured toward the thriving garden that now occupied nearly half of their former cornfield. "What if we don't try to save the farm the old way? What if we do something different?" She'd been thinking about this for days, the idea growing like the beans themselves, slowly but with increasing certainty. "Mrs. Chen says these plants could feed a dozen families through winter. And Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store has been asking where she can get fresh vegetables since the Morrison farm went under. What if we partnered with Mrs. Chen? Made this into something new?" Robert was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands gentle as he touched a particularly vigorous squash vine. "You mean give up on corn entirely?" "I mean stop fighting what the land is trying to tell us," Emma replied, surprised by her own certainty. Great-grandpa grew corn because that's what worked in his time. But maybe this is what works in ours. A car door slammed in the distance, and they looked up to see a woman in khaki pants and a university t-shirt walking toward them, a camera and notebook in her hands. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the extension agent, had sounded intrigued when Mrs. Chen had called to describe their unusual companion planting success. "You must be Emma and Robert," Dr. Martinez said as she approached, her eyes already scanning the field with professional interest. "Helen told me about what you've accomplished here, but seeing it—" She shook her head in apparent amazement. "This is remarkable." What followed was the most hopeful conversation Emma had experienced in months. Dr. Martinez photographed the interplanted crops, took soil samples, and asked detailed questions about their methods and results. But more than that, she talked about sustainable agriculture, about changing climate conditions, about the growing demand for locally sourced produce. "There's a program," she explained as they walked through the rows together, "for farms transitioning to alternative crops. Grants available, technical support, guaranteed buyers through the State Food Service Program. What you've created here, by accident or design, it's exactly what we've been hoping to see." Mrs. Chen appeared as if she'd been waiting for this moment, emerging from her own property with a fresh thermos of tea and a plate of cookies made with flour ground from some of the early harvest. As the three adults discussed possibilities, crop rotation schedules, expanded plantings, partnership agreements, Emma found herself drifting to the edge of the field where it bordered the old dirt road. A meadowlark perched on the fence post there, the same bright shoulder patches she remembered from the morning her mother had left. But instead of flying away when Emma approached, it tilted its head and studied her with one bright eye, as if recognizing something familiar. "She'll come back," a voice said softly behind her. Emma turned to find Mrs. Chen approaching with 2 cups of tea, her expression gentle with understanding. "My mother, when she's ready to see what grew while she was gone." Mrs. Chen handed Emma the warm cup, steam rising between them like incense. "Some people need to leave before they can see the beauty of staying. This does not make them weak. It makes them human." Emma sipped the jasmine tea, its familiar fragrance now associated with evening porches and quiet wisdom. What if she doesn't want to come back to this? To something different from what she left? "Then she will know you grew strong without her," Mrs. Chen replied. "And that is also a gift, to know that your children can survive, can thrive, can create hope from what seems like ending." As afternoon settled over the field, Dr. Martinez helped them develop a plan. Robert would apply for the transition program, Mrs. Chen would formally enter into partnership, and Emma, to her amazement, would be enrolled in a summer youth agriculture program that would teach her about sustainable farming practices and business management. "You have good instincts," Dr. Martinez told Emma as she prepared to leave. "This companion planting approach, the way you've adapted to changing conditions rather than fighting them, that's the future of farming in this region." That evening, as they sat on the porch with Mrs. Chen sharing their usual tea and conversation, Emma pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Not a letter to her mother, she wasn't ready for that yet, but a journal entry about the day, about the plans taking shape, about the way hope could sprout in the most unlikely places. "What are you writing?" her father asked. "A record," Emma replied, her pen moving steadily across the page. "For later. So we remember how it felt when everything changed." The meadowlark called once more from the field, its song bright and defiant against the gathering dusk. Emma looked up from her writing to see the first stars appearing in the clear sky, and for the first time since her mother had driven away into the dust cloud, she felt excited about tomorrow. The drought wasn't over, and the old life was gone forever. But something new was growing in its place, something stronger, more resilient, more beautiful than what they'd lost. And Emma was tending it with her own hands, growing into someone her mother might not recognize when she finally came home. "The seeds," Mrs. Chen had said, "always find their way." Looking out at their impossible garden thriving in the midst of loss, Emma finally understood what that meant. If Emma's story touched your heart, If it reminded you of the quiet strength that lives in ordinary people, or if it planted a seed of hope in the middle of your own difficult season, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that growth is still possible, even in the hardest ground. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're here to tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that kindness still thrives in the most unexpected places. Until next time, never stop believing in the power of second chances and the miracles that can sprout from the seeds we plant in our darkest moments.